Good morning, everyone. I'm Janet Tulland with Middle East Peace Now. I happen to be the president, and I'm proud to serve as such. Welcome to all who have decided to join us this morning. Our attendance, we know, is going to be low, but you also know that the recording will be available. There's a very important rally that's coming up, and we're certainly aware of that. Want you all to know that we arrange the dates for our forums and our presenters well in advance, and had we known that the No Kings rally would take place today, we might have shifted things. But knowing that we always record, we decided to stay with the original date. So for that, I will proceed. We'd like to thank our sponsors to begin, as we always do, Northfielders for Justice in Palestine, Israel, and Women Against Military Madness. We appreciate these two organizations and any others that support our forums. Please consider supporting them by attending their events as well. And before I introduce our speaker, Tom, our tech, will share some housekeeping items. You can see that they are on the screen, and I'll go through them. All participants will be muted for the duration of the event. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom. There is a little Q&A at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen. And we'll put your questions in the queue and take them in the order that they arrive. Sometimes our questions overlap, so if I don't exactly bring up your question, it's because it might have been covered with a similar one. Please use the chat feature for any administrative help or questions such as I can't hear or something like that, and we'll do our very best to assist you. Be respectful in the chat as well as in the Q&A. We reserve the right to remove anyone who is causing harm. If Zoom is not working for you, email us at mepn@mepn.org and we'll do our best to help. Those are the few housekeeping items. Those of you who have been with us before certainly are familiar with them. And now to introduce our guest speaker. Moneer Rifai is a Palestinian American with roots in Lebanon, now living here in Minnesota. He's dedicated to community building, fostering civil dialogue, promoting peace, and amplifying moderate voices to create positive, lasting change. He has spoken to many community groups, schools, and congregations here in Minnesota, and perhaps more widely, Moneer, you can address that. He's been featured on Minnesota Public Radio and other media outlets as well. Welcome, Moneer, to Middle East Peace Now. You have the floor.
Thank you, Janet, and good morning, and thank you for this introduction and for having me. I'm honored to be invited to talk today. Can you hear me okay, and you see me okay? Perfect. I'd like to share some slides here, so I'm going to share my screen. If you hang with me for one moment. Okay, let me share my screen now. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, it's just a forest background though.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. One second here.
It's funny, we went through all this and it never fails.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay. I think when I started my presentation, it just crashed or something. Okay. You should see it now.
We're good now.
Okay, I apologize about this. Okay, again, thank you again, and I'm honored to be here, and I'm happy to speak to you folks this morning. My name is Moneer, and I'm here to talk to you about a slightly more, maybe less common approach to advocacy and advocating for peace and for Palestinian issues and Middle East peace. But I have to start by acknowledging that you probably already know what the content of this will be from the title and from the introduction. And I don't think I could have picked a more challenging time to to talk about this message. As we all know, the last couple days, couple weeks have been very difficult. So I'm being honest that some of what I'm going to say today, on some days I wake up and I don't feel, I know cognitively and intellectually, I believe in my message and in my approach, but some days I feel like I just cannot um, the events of what's going on contradict with kind of my intellectual and cognitive uh, message here. So I just want to put that out there, and I also want to say that this is maybe one approach I follow, which is focusing on dialogue, focusing on calling for peace and humanizing each other. But this is by no means the only approach. By no means, I don't mean to pass judgment on more confrontational approaches, on more, on protests. Certainly, I've been part of these protests and pressure campaigns, and I do think they're effective. And I think most movements are often effective when they're multifaceted. So there's no one way to do things. It's it's a multifaceted approach. Okay, so with that being out of the way, just a quick background about myself. So my name is Moneer Rifai. I run this little blog here where I talk about some of the stuff we'll be talking about today. And I live in Hopkins, Minnesota, just 15 minutes or so west of Minneapolis. I've I work in tech. I live here with my wife and my daughter. I have a 3-year-old daughter. So if you hear some noises in the background, she promised to be quiet today. So I apologize. We live in an old house. So if she's running around or causing trouble, you might hear some noise in the background. I grew up in Lebanon, as Janet mentioned, but my family is actually Palestinian, and I'll talk more about kind of the whole connection between Palestine and Lebanon. I moved to the US in 2000, so I've been here for a while, and I work in the tech field. I'm a software developer. As I mentioned, I grew up in Lebanon. My family is Palestinian. My family lived, so this is a map I often show. My family lived in northern Palestine in a small town just outside of the modern day city of Safed. So it's 10 miles or so south of the Lebanese border. And my family obviously left in 1948. And when they fled the events of 1948, it was natural for them to move to Lebanon. And that's kind of where I grew up. Lebanon is, and by the way, as an aside, I often do kind of a historic background of the conflict and talk about key events and dates, but I have a feeling I don't need to do this today because you all know a lot about what's going on. So I'm doing things differently. I often spend more time just given a historical background when I talk to groups and community groups and congregations. So I'm going to skip past that, but if there's any question about some of the history, please do ask. As most of you know, many refugees left in 1948 and moved to the neighboring countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. My family ended up in Lebanon, and there's a large Palestinian population in Lebanon. And something I have to explain. So I was born in Lebanon, but technically I'm not Lebanese. And this could be a whole other topic about the dynamics of why we never became Lebanese. And we actually we kind of kept our Palestinian identity. We lived in a Palestinian community for the most part. Many Palestinians live in Lebanon, live in refugee camps, and those are permanent, highly dense camps where conditions are pretty rough. Thankfully, my family did not live in one of these camps. I've been to them many times, but my family managed to, for the most part, lead a middle class life. My dad is or he's retired now, but was a physician who worked for the UN, for UNRWA, the agency that kind of helps with Palestinian refugees in the Middle East. So so we were lucky to not live in one of these refugee camps, but conditions in those camps and the conditions of the Palestinians in Lebanon and in other countries historically have been difficult. For example, as Palestinians in Lebanon, and again, despite the fact that I was born there, I'm not a citizen of Lebanon, but also that also means I don't have many of the, or I did not have many of the rights and access to things like being able to vote or even owning property. You can't own, you can't buy, you can't have a business. So as being Palestinian in Lebanon is very difficult. And historically, when things in Lebanon were slightly, as some of you know, there was a period of conflict in Lebanon. So laws were not as enforced. But when that ended, living in Lebanon as a Palestinian became very, very difficult, because if you can't work, if you don't have any civil rights, if you don't have access to any benefits, then being a Palestinian in Lebanon was very difficult. So as Palestinians, you grew up and you kind of kept that identity, and so in some ways, I'm glad I maintained that identity and did not completely get absorbed into a different identity. So that's kind of a quick background about my family. This is my ancestral village where my family lived. It's called Moneer Rifai, and it has been fully ethnically cleansed, or as they say on Wikipedia, depopulated as of May 1948. There's basically nothing left. It's now, I think it's like basically an open country. These pictures, I should have mentioned the source. They're from this amazing project called PalestineRemembered.net, where they document all these towns and cities, and they have images and interviews, and it's a wonderful resource. On the left, you can see one of the few standing walls or structures, and on the right here, this is actually an olive oil press. That part of the country has a lot of olive tree groves, and this is kind of what's left of it now. I found some other images where you can see Israeli settlements that are adjacent to this to the site of this village. I think at the peak in 1948, it had roughly about 500 or 600 residents. So it's a fairly small village. And it's in the district of Safed. So it's close to the city of Safed, but the town itself was a fairly small village. My family, my grandparents lived there. They were mostly, they did actually own quite a bit of land, and olive oil and olive trees. And I wish I knew more about that history. Most of my grandparents, or all of them, have passed since. But during the events of 1948, many of them thought, "Hey, we're just gonna leave for a couple of weeks." And you probably heard some stories where people did not even, people took their house, they locked their houses and took the key, and they were expecting to come back in a week or two. And I remember talking to my grandma, and that was the feeling that we're just going to be gone for a couple of weeks and come back until things calm down. And obviously, they never came back. So it's a painful experience for that generation, and something that was passed. These stories were passed down to to their children and grandchildren. So I started talking about, as I mentioned, I've been living here in the US since about 2000, and early on, very few people knew about Lebanon or Palestine, and it's been amazing seeing how this changed over the last 20, 25 years. Honestly, the average person, in the early 2000s did not know what Palestine is. As a matter of fact, one of my in-laws, before they were my in-laws, he thought he thought I was from Pakistan, because they did not know what Palestine is. And seeing how the issue of Palestine has been prominent in the consciousness of the American public has been amazing. And obviously this changed when we had the first Gaza conflict in 2008, and then, or not the first conflict, but it was a major conflict in 2008, and we had some more events, and obviously the events of the last couple of years have made Palestine and the issue of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian struggle has become a central issue in the West. And I never imagined this would have been the case. I started talking and getting involved in raising awareness over the last 10 years or so. And a few circumstances and meetings I've had with people kind of inspired me to try a slightly more different approach. And that's kind of what I'm talking about today. And I was very surprised by the reception. I'm sharing some images here. This is in the middle. This is back when we lived in Iowa. I held a community event with a local Jewish leader, and that event was so well received that it kind of inspired me to continue doing some more of these events. So after the events of October 7, I also had a similar event with Rabbi Jill Averin, who's based out of the Twin Cities area here. So we held an event in Hopkins, which is, again, just outside of Minneapolis, and that was very well received. It was covered in some news, local news, and NPR did a piece on this effort. That so in the lower right, that's myself and the rabbi I mentioned, and a few other folks. So the four of us, actually, that's my wife across from me, and then another Jewish leader on the left. The four of us who started this effort, this dialogue effort, we've held several events and discussions and public awareness. And I've been basically talking to a lot of community groups, sometimes with an individual like Rabbi Jill, or sometimes by myself, but often the message is similar. So I've spoken to many congregations, schools, community groups, and some of these groups are mostly just your average American. Some of these are folks that maybe have connection to Israel somehow. So maybe they're, as some of you know, we have a large Jewish population in the Twin Cities. So I've spoken to groups who are maybe have connections to Jewish communities or to Israel, and overall that the reception has been very positive. I'm gonna move on to the next slide here. So what I would like to talk about here is how I do this, and then we'll maybe share some more stories and some things I learned from doing these discussions. And again, these discussions were sometimes in small groups with members of the Jewish community or folks with connection to Israel. Sometimes they're just public conversations with kind of like this, but maybe with just an object or an audience who doesn't really um, have a stake in in the conflict. So it's kind of a variety of audiences. And the way I do this, or my approach, is basically understanding where quote unquote the other is coming from, and um, this stems from kind of a true curiosity I have about the other, whoever that other might be. Just as an aside, if we take an aside from kind of the issue of the Middle East issue here, but I am, as you might probably guess, I identify as a progressive person, and I, for example, have been just utterly confused at the popularity of this new movement, that new concerning movement we've seen in the US for the last 5 or 6 or 8 years. And for me, it's unfathomable. Why would somebody support the erosion of democracy and sacred institutions and freedom and public education and you name it? But the more you talk to people, the more you talk to folks who have different backgrounds, I was finding out that not everyone is horrified by these issues that are extremely concerning to most of us. But there are many folks out there that are just struggling to get by. They're struggling to make ends meet. They're just unable to find gainful employment, unable to they're struggling with addiction, with loneliness, with financial struggles, and it's manifesting itself as anger and frustration, and sometimes that kind of leads them to these extreme political views. So just being able to talk to people that don't share my background and values has been very insightful for me in this area. And likewise, talking to folks who I guess are on the other side of this conflict have been very insightful to me too. So the way I do this is, these conversations have really been insightful and helpful for me to understand where, and I use the other side in quotes because, I'd like to talk more about how this conflict is being realigned now. But I think as a Palestinian and as a Palestinian person, we need to acknowledge the trauma, the generational trauma and the historic injustice that the Jewish people have suffered. I think as a Palestinian, there's nothing I can do to express my grief and my anger about how the Jewish people historically have been treated, from the discrimination we all know about, to the pogroms, and to obviously culminating in the events of the Holocaust. That's an important issue that we need to acknowledge. And at the same time, we need to affirm the right to live, the Jewish people's right to live in freedom of fear and persecution. And if we do that, we also need to affirm, that's kind of where I'd like to shift is, if we affirm that Jewish people need to live in freedom and freedom of suffering and persecution, we also need to affirm the Palestinians' people's right to live freely and to have self-determination. And I often reference the book of Genesis, where the concept is called B'Tselem Elohim in Hebrew, which is God created man in his own image. And what that means, it means everybody, everyone, you, Janet, everyone on this call, a kid in Gaza, we all are worthy of if you're a person of faith, we're all are worthy of God's love, and we have infinite potential, and we're all equal. And for me, that should be the starting point for these conversations. And I think most people would have a hard time arguing this. I think most people, some do, but the vast majority of people cannot argue this point that everybody should be treated equally and thought of equally, and that every life is sacred, no matter who you are, no matter what background you're from, or age, or nationality. So if we can acknowledge that, we can maybe shift to talking about the present moment. And obviously, I don't need to tell you what's going on today. Breaks my heart. I'm sure it breaks many of your hearts as well. We acknowledge the historic injustice, but we also need to shift to the current injustice happening today, this very moment as we're speaking. Children in Gaza are dying of famine, and we don't need to, we could talk about the history, but we need to kind of talk about what's happening today. So that's kind of my approach in these conversations. And I find that people are open to that, because once we acknowledge the injustices that everybody has gone through, everybody has experienced, it's really difficult to close your heart to kind of what's going on today. And so that's kind of the how of my approach, or of the approach that I'm envisioning for this growing coalition of moderates. And just a brief discussion of why I do this. And as I mentioned, I do it because I truly have a deep desire to understand the other. And I do it because it's effective. And I'm not doing it just to, I'm not just paying lip service here, but I truly think it is an effective way to reach people, an effective way to break through this extreme political or extreme divide we have. And I do it because it is, in some ways, it's strategic, but it's also true. I mean, it is, I truly, as I got to know, as I mentioned, I get to know folks, I made friendships, I met people, and I saw that many other people that don't share my views they have their own struggles and anxieties and fears, and so it's coming from a true place of empathy, I guess, and but at the same time, it is effective. And the fact of the matter is, despite the growing awareness of what's going on in Gaza and Palestine, the average American, and when I say the average American, I'm not saying the average American on this call or maybe in our activist circles, but the average American you talk to on the street, they're still unsure, uncomfortable about supporting or relating to Palestinians. And I found that just simply talking about the atrocities of what's happening, just kind of highlighting the injustice and the atrocities, sometimes just people shut down. And I've had a few interactions. Somebody who's actually fairly close to me at one point said, I don't want to hear another sob story about the dying kids. And it kind of shocked me, but I think people are just overwhelmed with, when people are overwhelmed with this emotional with the images and the stories, they simply shut down. And it's sad, but the fact of the matter is, most people cannot relate to a kid in Gaza. I'll share a quick story. I have, as I mentioned, I've done some talks with a friend of mine who's a rabbi, and at one of our community talks, we had we're talking about, she shared a story about her kids. Her kids are, I think, 12 and 13, and after October 7, one of her kids asked, "Mom, are we going to have, is there going to be another Holocaust?" And that was heartbreaking, and that really, really touched me. And then in the audience, I had some friends of mine that were attending, and a friend of mine who's a mom of a 12-year-old, she started crying, and that was very touching. But the fact of the matter is, she can relate to, she's able to relate to Rabbi Jill's children, but she's unable to relate to, I mean, don't blame her, but she's unable to relate to the kids dying in Gaza, because she just doesn't have any context or any mental image for that. So the fact of the matter is, we do need a different approach than just simply other than highlighting the injustice and the atrocities. And I do think being able to have people relate to what's happening, or find ways to kind of get through this emotional wall that people sometimes put up when they're confronted with just unimaginable suffering and injustice. I think that's an effective way to get through that emotional block. And the reason I think we should do more of this type of effort is, I truly believe that I've been touched and moved to see so many folks that are of Jewish background, for example, come to protests. I think there's a huge, increasingly large coalition, large percentage of folks from Jewish backgrounds, folks who have historically, maybe not Jewish, but historically were more pro-Israel, and now they're just seeing what's happening. And I think being able to talk to them in a less threatening way is more conducive to building coalition with this increasing section of people that are sick of seeing this conflict drag on and just spiral out of control. And I think building coalition with these groups is very effective. And I truly believe that we're going through a realignment of this conflict at this point. It's no longer Arabs versus Israelis, or Arabs versus Jews, or however you want to think of it. I truly think it's now the extremists versus the moderates. And I think my goal is to kind of reframe this narrative of Arabs versus Israelis, because you're seeing more people committed to dialogue and peace. It's basically, the way I think of this conflict is, people are committed to dialogue and peace, and versus those who are committed to waging war and violence. And I can tell you, as a Palestinian, I will tell you, there's a decent voice in the Palestinian community that does not want dialogue and peace. They're traumatized, they're hurt, they're angry. And as we know, there's also a large contingent of society in Israel, and of maybe Jewish folks, or folks who are aligned with the state of Israel, that also are not committed to peace and dialogue. So I think we're seeing a realignment now. And just yesterday, actually 2 days ago, I heard an interview with Ehud Olmert, who was a prime minister of Israel in, I believe it was 2006 to 2009. And it was amazing. I mean, this is a politician who historically has been he was member of the Likud party, so he's not like extremely progressive, but he is advocating, with a Palestinian politician, and obviously trying to advocate for the end of the war, and trying to start this conversation about changing the nature of the dialogue. I mean, I don't know if anybody heard, if anyone heard this interview. Was on the Ezra Klein podcast just a couple days ago, and I was inspired. And I do think there's a rising. I do think the loudest voices are those on the extremes. And I think what we need to do is we need to amplify those in the middle who are being completely drowned out by the extreme voices. And I do think that's the only path forward. I truly think this is a conflict that does not have, there's no way to win in this conflict. I think the only path forward is to have these voices of moderates be amplified, and have the vision of dialogue and peace grow and drown out the extremists, be it some of the extremist Palestinian groups like Hamas, or some of the extremist politicians in Israel. And as we know, right now, Israeli politics has been basically taken over by the likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu, and this is kind of the problem here. Is you have a small group of extremists that are completely shaping this narrative and shaping this conflict. Just like to take a break here. Any questions so far, or should I keep going?
Moneer,
Yes.
I hate to interrupt, but just learned about a terrible event. I will read from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune.
Okay.
This was as of 10:13 a.m., just a few moments ago. Hold on. Representative Melissa Hortman has been killed. Senator John Hoffman shot in targeted shootings. Governor Tim Walz said there were targeted shootings in both Brooklyn Park and Champlain on Saturday. Tim Walz confirms that Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were killed in what the governor called a politically motivated assassination. They were shot and killed this morning in what appears to be a politically motivated. Our state has lost a great leader, and I lost the dearest of friends. I did type a question in the Q&A related to this. I'm just in shock here. How can we deal with these senseless actions that so directly refute a peaceful response to injustice? And I know you don't have the answer to this, but I did want to bring this to light to our audience.
I'm just seeing this right now. That is very tragic.
It's unspeakable. I mean, Minnesota has always been known as a state of reason. Well, I'll say that.
Yeah.
And you were talking about this, how you've been shocked by the shift in how people are responding to, are advocating a violent approach to solving problems.
That's very tragic. It does look like I was seeing the news, and looks like there's a manifesto, and that is very tragic. I'm sorry to hear this. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in now. I mean, this extreme is, I think you'll probably will find that most people find this reprehensible, but a select few, this has been an example, are causing so much noise and so much attention. Obviously this is a heinous act here. Somebody who's an innocent person being killed, being assassinated, is. But I think very, very, very few people, if any, would agree that this is okay or this is acceptable. And that's, I think, where we need to do better. Everybody needs to do better about being very cautious from going to the extreme on either end, because sadly that's what ends up happening. That's how you end up. People get so radicalized, and then they commit unspeakable acts of violence and hatred.
And obviously the media is not helping this. A lack of sensible gun legislation contributes to this. It's like the perfect storm right now
Correct.
of ways to make it easier for people who have been radicalized to act upon their feelings.
Exactly.
Just to continue, so you all know, she was shot and she and her husband were killed in their home. A policeman, a man who was impersonating a policeman who even came up in a police SUV, entered the home, and it was an extremely targeted kill. And he is still on the loose.
Wow. Oh boy. Yeah, that's tragic.
I'm sorry to interrupt your
No.
feel we
Thank you for
had
sharing that. Yeah, thank you for sharing. This underscores kind of the danger of extremism, and
Yeah.
kind of maybe underscores the need to bring people back towards a more just more sensible, more moderate viewpoint. No matter, you can disagree, and I think that's maybe one thing I'd like to share about how we've had, and I will share some stories, because I certainly disagree in these conversations. When I say conversations, it's both like the community events, but also some of the one-on-one conversations I've had. We've had some really at length discussions and conversations with people who claim to be, Zionist and pro-Israel, and people obviously with connections, to that land, and also with people like myself who are Palestinian. And so we can disagree on many issues, but being able to disagree and kind of hold each other, or respect the humanity of each other is one thing. And then just being able to disagree, and then disagreeing with somebody and just basically not seeing them as human and almost justifying their, any violence committed against them is what we should be very cautious of. And we see this dynamic play out not in just the Middle East conflict, but we see it play out in, as soon is the case here, we see it play out in our politics, in our just domestic issues, immigration. I mean, you name it. You're seeing this move, or this tendency to just want to go so far to the extremes. And I do think this is a very dangerous dynamic that we need to combat. Everybody on this call, we need to combat this desire to move so far to the extremes.
Well, let's continue. We do have some other questions here. So,
Okay. Would
Do
you
you-
like to answer questions or?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and ask them, and then you can respond if that's all right with you.
Sure, yeah.
And I have to find them because I've lost. Here we go. Um, there is a comment from one of, actually a former board member. You mentioned Rabbi Jill Avron prominently. She is newly appointed as the Director of Campus Affairs of the Jewish Community Relations Council here in the Twin
Yes.
Cities. This organization's main purpose, according to this writer, is to advocate for Israel. Please explain how you bridge the gap between Rabbi Avron and the JCRC and your own position on justice for the Palestinians.
Yes, so I have to say that we've had, correct, I've actually just saw her yesterday, and she has recently been appointed as a campus, as a, it's a position that has to do with campus ministry or Jewish campus organizations. And as I mentioned, I have had many disagreements with her and with, so I just want to share this, just go back. This group here in the bottom right corner, that's her in the lower right corner, and across from her is a member of the Jewish community as well. And we've had many disagreements, and I find some of their views, personally, I'm not comfortable with with some of their views, but going back to this, kind of the only path forward is, I'm sure she's going to advocate for Israel, and she has, and many of the people that I've spoken to have advocated for Israel and often defended them. But I'm trying to understand why they're doing this. And so to answer the question, there has been, I think the question referenced a gap there has been this gap. And actually, at one discussion that we've had, we just got to this place where we just couldn't move forward. We were talking about what's happening in Gaza, and we just got stuck. We were saying, me and others were saying, look, this needs to end. What's happening in Gaza is, like, we can't, it's hard to do any more work on this issue if, with we can't justify what's happening in Gaza today. And this was a few months ago when things were not, things were pretty bad then, and then they basically just could not get past the notion that, no, this is needed. We're existentially threatened as a Jewish people, and we just got stuck there, Like, we kept saying no. So it felt like there's this gap that we had a hard time crossing, because, and that's maybe one thing I wanted to share. So I appreciate the question. One thing I wanted to share here is what I learned is the sense here of who's more traumatized. And at some point, she actually said, we need to avoid a competition in victimhood. And sadly what happens is, we're so tribal these days, and when people feel threatened, they always go inwards, right? They go to the tribal, my people. And it's good to do that sometimes, but there's a danger in being so tribal and so focused on your own tribe and your own struggles and your own existential fears and anxieties.
What it lacks is empathy. Then
Exactly.
empathy is missing.
That's exactly right. And that's kind of where we often get stuck is, and I'll be honest, and I'll say that many Palestinians feel that way too. And in some ways, you can't really blame them now. They're seeing their people being ethnically cleansed by the thousands, and there's talk about completely removing them. And there's, the fastest I think there's like an acceleration in violence in the West Bank and settlements. So in some ways you can't blame them. But I also think that we need to just find a way to just not, we need to find a way that we can't all be focused on our own existential anxiety, because that's exactly what many people are doing on both sides. Actually, I'd just like to read a quote from this interview with Olmert that I heard, and he said, and I quote, "You have to change the nature of the dialogue and the appeal to the Israeli people and start to talk in a different way. Instead of warning us all the time that we are on the verge of destruction," which is kind of common common play or approach by Israeli politicians, which is what this government has been doing for 15 years. You have to open a dialogue with Israeli society on a different basis, on the basis of hope. And there's many things I disagree with Olmert on, but the fact that he's seen that, look, we cannot just continue talking about we're on the verge of being destroyed, we need to protect ourselves, so we're gonna commit these acts. No, you have to kind of start seeing things differently. And he even like just made fun of this narrative. And he said, you think a bunch of Hamas fighters are gonna, or Hezbollah fighters are gonna destroy the state of Israel? We're like one of the most advanced nation where we have so much capabilities, and you've seen what, obviously we've seen the extent of their military and technological might. So he said this message is just, it's ridiculous, and that's what he said. So I'm not completely disregarding the fact that many people in Israel and the Jewish community are feeling a sense of their trauma being reawakened and a sense of anxiety. And so I'm not dismissing that, but he said we also need to change this narrative. So my attempt with people like to answer the question is, I would not expect anything else except that they would advocate for Israel and defend it. But at the same time, we need to find a way to accept that they're going to advocate for what they believe is an issue that's near and dear to them. But at the same time, it's okay to do that if you can see the other side as humans. And so, yeah, it's complicated. Obviously, it's not perfect.
Well, I
And
think Moneer, if I may, what you said much earlier, that you're seeing a shift in sentiment of Americans. 20 years ago, many people didn't even know who Palestinians were, and now
exactly,
there is
yeah.
this tiny little shift. Who knows where this all would have gone if October 7th had not happened? But what we're also dealing with is decade upon decade of indoctrination of the American public, as well as the Western world, certainly, as to what what the Jews deserve,
Mm-hmm.
their own land, i.e., their own land, and the narrative that came with that to support that reasoning. And it started out as false. It started out as false, and it has been false all along. And how do you make a false statement that has been viewed as true for decades be false?
Well, and that's kind of where things get a little complicated, because they'll argue it's not false. Many folks, especially when things when the conversation goes towards faith and history, and and that's kind of my point on the slide here, is competing historical narratives. That's a huge part of it. And many people say, well, this land is historically ours, and then Palestinians will say, well, no, we lived here. So,
And it was
yes,
empty.
yeah, exactly. I mean, we can sit and talk about history all day. You can have many books have been written on whose land it was, but my point is, and I actually wrote an article about this once. My point is, if one asks whose land is this anyway, does it even matter?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like we can sit down and just talk and analyze, books of the Old Testament and the Torah and Palestinian history, but does it even matter now that you have people being slaughtered and kids dying of hunger and disease? Who cares whose land it was or who lived in this parcel of land in 1400 or whatever? So I think and this is something that trips up so many of these discussions, and it was like this focus on history and biblical history, and my point is, look, let's acknowledge that there's history, there's obviously a history of Jewish persecution. Let's acknowledge that. Well, let's acknowledge these things, but let's kind of shift to talking about what's happening on the ground today. And that's one frustration of mine, is like when people want to just analyze and deep dive into, well, who did, which town was, I mean, it's endless. It's frustrating because it's just pointless. It's not pointless. I mean, history is important, obviously, but it's not as relevant. Let's kind of let's focus on what's going on now. Let's focus on the injustice taking place this moment, and then we can sit down and talk about history and come into some type of historical go on some type of historical discussion. But it's not as relevant to what's happening now. The fact of the matter is, you have these people that live there. You have a large number of Jewish people that live there. You have Palestinians who historically used to live there. Let's deal with it. And there's no going back in time. So yeah.
Yeah. This isn't a question, but it is it refers to a point that you made earlier and what we were talking about actually right now. The question was, statistically, do the majority of Americans now actually support the Palestinians? And it says here, in March of 2025, the latest poll shows that 55% of US adults favor establishing a Palestinian state. This is in line with readings since 2020, which have ranged from 52 to 55%. So according to this Gallup poll, there is a majority of Americans who think Palestine deserves a state. I'm a little surprised by that, to be honest.
Yeah, I would caution maybe about these numbers, because I've talked to many groups, and I can tell you this. I've given a talk at a high school, in Minneapolis, and I can tell just by the questions, many of these younger kids have have appear to be very supportive and very pro-Palestinian. But I can tell you that, and this kind of goes back to like the vision we have, and something I talk often about is the Israel of the 8-Day War in 1967 is not the same as the Israel today. And many people, especially those who are baby boomers, have this vision of this underdog nation that against all odds maintained to, or was able to prevail against Syria and Egypt, and this heroic image of what's his name, the general with the eye patch.
Yeah.
Is it Moshe Dayan or
Bacon,
and
one of the two.
yeah. So like these historic images, these heroic images that basically, I mean, these Israeli generals were like rock stars in the 60s and 70s, but that's not the same nation that's not the Israel of 2025 and even 2020 or 2015. So the younger kids don't really know what happened. I mean, they might, but that this image of Israel that they have is not the same one. And that's why, for example, Biden was, an avowed, he called himself an avowed Zionist, because many of these older people, and this matches my personal, this is anecdotal, obviously, but it matches my personal experience. Many folks who are of a certain generation have this other image of Israel that hasn't really been updated to reflect what has happened in the last 10, 20, 25 years. So in my experience, these numbers might be, I mean, that does seem there does seem to be a shift in the in the views on Palestine, but you'd be surprised once you go out of the more urban areas, you'd be surprised at how many folks still have that image of Israel as this
The David and Goliath.
David and Goliath, the only democracy fighting these backwards Arab nations. I mean, it's rampant, and that's why I go to a church group, for example, and that's why I need to kind of be cautious of how I approach talking about Palestinians, because many many of these like a grandma at church is not going to be comfortable going to a protest or seeing from the river to the sea or free Palestine. They're not comfortable with this because they find it intimidating, they find it scary, because they think of Palestinians as as violent. They think of Palestinians as the other. And so yeah, I found it more effective to kind of using this approach, kind of open their heart, open their mind to actually being able to see Palestinians as people, and not just as this scary entity that is anti-democratic and anti-Semitic. So yeah, I guess I do agree that there has been a shift in public opinion, but I think a huge part, especially the older generation, is still entrenched and kind of has this view of Israel that hasn't really been updated.
When you spoke with Rabbi Avron, have you ever spoken at JCRC or at a temple, a synagogue, or has it always been she comes to the church and you speak together, that kind of a thing?
It's mostly been at I haven't spoken to at a temple or a synagogue, but
Have they ever I mean, that's always my question is, churches seem open to having both sides, if I can use the term, come to speak, but you never see that at the Jewish Community Relations Center. That's
Well,
unfortunate.
true, and I think part of it is this sense of just existential anxiety and a sense of victimhood that we're talking about here. And I would say they're probably not comfortable with that. And I would
Well,
say I don't think a mosque would be comfortable inviting a Jewish speaker either. But I would be, if anybody here would like me. I mean, I've actually reached out to some Jewish communities, and I'd be happy to come and speak to them, to come and speak at their synagogue or whatever. But usually most of these events have been in more public, more like community type settings. So at a community center or at a at an event open to the public. But I have to say, like this one, especially this one that I talked about that we had after September 7th, this one in the lower left corner was, I live in the western suburbs. It's there's a large Jewish community here. So my sense was the audience, I think we had over 100 people, maybe 200 people, maybe 150 people. My sense was the audience was fairly, most of it was a Jewish, had connections to the Jewish community. So there were very few what I perceive to be as Arabs or Palestinians or Muslims. There were some, but not many.
okay, we'll move on. Just a reminder, if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A and not the chat so that we don't miss them. This is from the chat. These are tough to read. What kind of a conversation do you expect to have with people who have committed the most heinous crime in the history of mankind? Disingenuous statement. I do not have to have sympathy for people who murder with glee and post it on social media. We are far beyond conversation at this point. Sanctions and massive reparations are in order.
that's how many people feel. I understand that sentiment, and I, speaking of, I wanted to talk about pushback. Often I get pushback, and some of the pushback comes from, from my own community. And I guess my answer is, and I'll be open here, is I'll be frank that nothing else has worked. Sanctions, BDS has been effective, but it has been very, very, very slow. It's been just a really slow. I mean, again, I'm supportive of BDS and other types of pressure campaigns, but it just hasn't been. It's been what, 85 some years, and it's just going from bad to worse. So I just feel like I I don't think we need, conversation does not mean that I just want to be clear that conversation does not mean that um, you know, I, uh, I'm okay with what's happening with just the heinous crimes being committed. I'm not. But I think many, many, many Jewish folks, many folks who are historically pro-Israel, or many Americans, many Westerners are also equally uncomfortable with what's going on. And I think we need to bring those people out, because they're seeing the kind of on the sidelines saying, I'm not comfortable with this, I don't like this, but they also don't feel like they also say, well, yeah, but I don't, I'm not pro Hamas, or I'm not. So I think the idea is to kind of move away from this dichotomy of, you're either two things: you're either pro Hamas and anti-Semite, or you're pro Israel and pro genocide. So I'm trying to move away from that, from these two extremes, because I think you're going to find many, many people are in the middle. Many people, including Jewish people, including Israelis even, don't are very, very upset at what's going on and are very unhappy, but they feel like they're stuck. You're either you're either on this extreme or this extreme. So I'm trying to kind of amplify these voices in the middle, because that's really what we need. And I'm also trying to find something that might move the needle a little bit, in a way that's maybe more effective than just these very long-term sanctions and and other
Or in
confrontational
addition to,
campaigns.
yeah, or in addition to.
Or in addition
Yeah,
to, as I
yeah,
mentioned in the beginning, which I think it's a
yeah,
multifaceted approach. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you. Let's see if we have others. I think we've kind of gone through the questions. There is a comment. There are some other comments here, so I will read those. I do not see Hamas as, quote, extremist. They are foremost Palestinian resistant. They are foremost a Palestinian, pardon me, they are the foremost Palestinian resistance organization. October 7th was not as originally presented. I don't know who said this. There's no website to support this. So I don't know if Moneer, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would like to caution, maybe, I think, personally speaking, I do not agree with I condemn Hamas and their ideology, and I understand why Hamas exists and why Hamas became so effective and so powerful. Hamas is a manifestation of the awful experience of Gazans for the last 20 some years. It's their anger and frustration being manifested um,
The
in
most extreme
Hamas
way.
in the most extreme way. Yeah.
Yeah.
With that being said, I personally think that in this case, armed struggle is not the most effective solution. I know some people disagree, but I think armed struggle, especially the way that Hamas conducts it, um, again, I understand why they're doing, and I understand the reasoning. They say, oh, this is, I mean, there's a lot, they have their own reasoning for why they're doing things. I condemn it. I don't agree with it. And I caution against maybe supporting it, because I think at the end of the day, you have to think strategically, and you have to think of this as you have to understand how this looks like. You might maybe understand Hamas's actions, but the average Western person, the average Western nation is not going to stand for those kind of actions. And those type of organizations like Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not, they're actually going to hurt the Palestinian cause in the long term, I believe, because it is not conducive to international support and empathy, especially when civilians are targeted and involved. So I would basically caution maybe against amplifying like Hamas's ideology. With that being said, I understand why groups like Hamas exist, and I understand, and also let's be honest here, and this is not me being, this has been widely reported that who was it that said Hamas, it was I think Smotrich or the finance minister, or maybe Netanyahu even, he said Hamas is an asset and the Palestinian Authority is a burden.
Gives them
So
reason. Yeah.
yeah, so it is widely known and publicly known that Israel turned a blind eye to all the cash being funneled to Hamas, because it does, it's an effective tool they can use to justify some the actions that are being taken. So I would say Hamas, in my opinion, does not really help the Palestinian cause.
I, to punctuate that, in the early 90s, I was with a group and we met with the personnel director of Yasser Arafat back when he was still alive. And he made a comment to our group that I never forgot. You treat people like dogs long enough and they begin to behave like one. And that pretty much sums
Yes.
it up for me. So
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
there's one more comment, and then I think that we are toward the end here. Actually, it's just a comment again, and I don't know if you need to respond. If you compare Hamas and Israel government and military with regard to the killing of civilians quantitatively, there is no comparison. There is no Palestinian voice that is in any way equivalent to or as powerful as AIPAC, and we certainly agree to that. I don't know if you need to respond.
Yeah, I mean, APAC is a very powerful, influential voice, and but again, I do think that the dynamics are changing, and I think you will see. I'm hoping you will see over the next months and years, kind of a discomfort with I mean I think you already are seeing, especially with the events of the past few days. I think these dynamics are changing, and I think you will see, if we can succeed in amplifying a more moderate voice, and also amplifying the um, or shedding light on the humanity of the Palestinian people, then I think you will see a whole different dynamic in terms of how we think about this conflict.
And
But yeah,
on that,
yeah.
I think we will close. Munir, thank you so much. I, I totally get where you're coming from. You said at one point, what else has worked?
Yeah, yeah,
What else has worked? So, um, we're all in this together to try to figure out how our voices can be heard. And so keep talking. Thank you so much for joining
thank you for
us this
having me.
morning.
Thank you for the wonderful questions, and have a good day.
Um, just to close, please complete our very short evaluation. It's found in the chat link in the sidebar, and Tom just inserted that. So take a few minutes to respond. It'll take you no more than 5 minutes. So please. There will be no forum in July. We typically take a month off in the summer. However, in early August, I believe it's August 9th, we will present our summer in-person event, which will focus on how we, as defenders of the rights of Palestinians, can respond to other groups' misguided comments about anti-Semitism, Zionism, and other tropes regarding Palestinians and Jews in this country and elsewhere. More information about this event will be coming up in the MailChimp in your email. And finally, we hope you find our MEP and forum speakers to be informed, justice-oriented, and engaging. If so, please consider donating to MEPN. Tom has just inserted a link to allow you to donate online, or if you prefer to mail us a check, you can do that too. Check your email for any further announcements. And thank you everyone for joining us. I was going to end too. There are many, many events taking place. Our country and our world, we're at a crossroads, and we can no longer sit back and let others do the job of resistance. It is all up to us. So on that note, I will close. Thank you, everyone.